Stonehenge. It's one of the world's most wondrous and mysterious prehistoric sites, and has captured people's imagination since at least the 12th century, when Geoffrey of Monmouth compiled his tales of King Arthur and Merlin. Its massive upright stones inspire awe, and many theories have been proposed as to how it might have been constructed, and by whom. Everything from giants to aliens have been suggested. The antiquarians of the 19th century believed it was the work of the Celts, but more recently it was believed to be constructed by the Neolithic Farmers. Yet new chronology and genetic evidence may pose challenges for this view. What is the truth behind its origin? Who really built Stonehenge? Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel through Patreon or PayPal. Your support helps me to make videos like this, and you also gain access to exclusive content. Much thanks to all of my supporters. Now, the first thing to understand about Stonehenge is that the site developed and changed over a long period of time. Around 3100 BC, it began as a bank and ditch enclosure, either initially or somewhat later, surrounded by a stone circle. Between that time and 2600 BC, it was used as a burial site for the cremated remains of the people at that time, and sometime around 2600, wooden posts may have been set up around the edge of the site. It is only after this period that the Sarsen stones are erected, though calculating the exact date of this development has proved very difficult, and has provided many and varying answers over the last several decades. Now, the earliest period of the site can be definitively attributed to the people who lived in Britain at that time, the first farmers, or Neolithic farmers. They were descendants of the people who migrated from Anatolia and spread throughout Europe, initiating the Neolithic Revolution, which transformed Europe from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural one. They are thought to have arrived in Britain around 4500 BC, bringing that lifestyle with them. They were genetically close to the population of present-day Sardinia. The famous Otzi is a very well-preserved example of these early farmers. He died sometime around 3200 BC, and was found frozen in the ice of the Alps in 1991. Though the British population had their own particularities genetically, they developed from the same initial population as Otzi, and would have looked very similar. So, when you see images like this purporting to represent the people who built Stonehenge, this is not accurate. They looked almost exactly like Southern Europeans do today. These Neolithic farmers built many wondrous structures throughout Britain and Ireland, such as the Stones of Stonehenge, the Brug na Boine, and many other passage tombs and megalithic stone features. They built the earliest stone circles as well as bank and ditch enclosures, which would continue to be used well into the Iron Age. However, they did not, as far as we know, create anything else quite like the final version of Stonehenge. The defining feature of Stonehenge is that it uses lintel stones fitted together using mortise and tenon joints, mimicking techniques used in carpentry. No other Neolithic structure in Britain demonstrates the use of this technique. That doesn't mean they couldn't have done it, but it raises questions. That a stone structure would be built mimicking wooden creations is a typical progression in style. We see the same evolution in the design of Greek temples. Early Greek temples were built entirely out of wood, and when they transitioned to stone, they attempted to exactly replicate the wooden style, even down to the wooden pegs used in the original construction. This is because the form itself became sacred. At least the general concept and layout of the Stonehenge Sarsen ring would have been derived from a similar style made out of wood. Wooden circles are known in nearby Woodhenge, and also in Ireland, recently discovered on the hill of Tara. The key to understanding who created the later stages of Stonehenge is knowing when exactly the sarsen stones were placed. There have been many attempts to date this, including using carbon dating methods over decades, and these fluctuated almost every time. A recent comprehensive analysis of the carbon dating for the placing of the sarsen stones was conducted in 2015 in the paper The Age of Stonehenge, published by Durham University. The authors analyzed the carbon-14 datings derived from the Stonehenge site and others associated with it, and estimated the date for the placing of the sarsen stone circle sometime between 2580 and 2470, with the bluestone horseshoe section being set up in its current configuration between 2210 and 1930. The claim is 95% accuracy, but of course every date claims accuracy. The Wessex archaeological team, who does extensive field work in and around Stonehenge, instead puts the correct radiocarbon dating between 2440 and 2100 BC, which, although we may think is only a few hundred years difference, makes all of the difference when we are talking about who might have built the structure. Other features, like the pathway of Stonehenge, are dated by most at being later than 2400 BC. Now, the total arrangement of the blue stones is perhaps the most significant and obvious change from the site's original configuration. Many have been designed to fit together using tongue and groove joints, while two have mortise holes akin to the sarsens. It's suggested that they were originally used to form a much earlier stone circle at the site, but they were redesigned for a more elaborate purpose at some point, and then reconfigured again over about a 400-year period. All of this activity on the site from different periods makes it very difficult to date, and even without this, it's difficult enough to date the placement of stones. However, even if we accept the study that favors an older date for the sarsen circle, there is still a glowing problem. Recent genetic findings paired with archaeology have conclusively demonstrated that between 2500 and 2200, massive changes were taking place in Britain that saw the near complete ethnic replacement of the Neolithic population. Though the exact dates are hazy, evidence suggests that well before the final placement of the bluestones, the Neolithic farmers were no longer the masters of Britain, and certainly not in the region of Stonehenge. They had by that time disappeared almost entirely from the genetic record as an independent population. It is impossible that the Neolithic farmers were responsible for at least the final configuration of Stonehenge as we know it today. Not far from Stonehenge itself are found numerous pit-style graves, not of the Neolithic farmers, but of a different people. They were sometimes buried with bows, arrows, other grave goods, most notably a bell-shaped beaker, from which the people began to be called by archaeologists the Bell Beakers. They are also the direct genetic ancestors of the Bronze and Iron Age Irish and British populations. They are so close direct ancestors that in genetic testing, my own results plot closer to many of these Chalcolithic Beaker people than to the average of the modern native population groups in Britain and Ireland, despite all of my ancestors having come from Britain and Ireland. One of the earliest known Beaker graves in Britain is found near Boscombe Down, 11 kilometers from Stonehenge. The first buried in the grave is generally identified as the Boscombe Bowman, and he is carbon-14 dated to have died sometime between 2580 and 2340, according to the same Durham University study. This falls almost exactly within the range of the construction of the sarsen stones of Stonehenge, although perhaps a few generations later. The Bowman would likely have been an important aristocrat or king, with his heirs being buried with him at the time of their later deaths. By this time, the region had to have been under the control of these Beaker people, or this type of sustained burial presence is unthinkable. That time period may have overlapped with the construction of Stonehenge, or closely follows it. Yet we cannot assume that the earliest known burial signifies the earliest date that Beaker people were present in the region. The Bowman, though often overshadowed by the much more famous Amesbury Archer, tells us a lot more about the situation in Britain at the time. Genetically, he carried steppe ancestry and the haplogroup R1b-L151. Based on recent genetic testing, the most probable scenario is that this group is derived from the corded ware culture, a related group to the Yamnaya, yet distinct. Corded ware populations have also been shown to carry large amounts of R1b-L151, and archaeological evidence also shows a continuity in the lower Rhine area and later Beaker populations. Likely, these are exactly the same populations, simply adopting different pottery styles. He was between 30 and 45 when he died, and he had suffered a severe leg injury comparable to that sustained in an automobile accident, or much more likely in his case, a fall from a running horse, or perhaps a blow with a heavy club. He was buried in a crouched position in a pit grave, and with him was an all-over corded-style bell beaker, made locally, but similar to those found in Central Europe. This is a more or less typical bell beaker-style burial, except not, for 3 children were buried near his head. One, aged 2 to 4, was cremated, and the other 2, aged between 5 and 7 years old, were inhumed with him. Also placed in the grave was a teenager and 2 adult men, yet they had been buried as disarticulated bones, likely having gone through a process of excarnation prior to burial. All of them were his descendants, buried with him at later times. But almost all of them are buried differently, according to different traditions. Though the man and his descendants carried steppe ancestry, this was not the typical bell beaker burial. It was instead something of an eclectic fusion of several different styles all in one grave. Cremation was practiced widely by the Neolithic farmer population. Excarnation is documented among some groups of Indo-Europeans, and possibly the Neolithic farmers as well. And collective burials were also a feature not of Indo-European steppe traditions, but of Neolithic farmers. Unlike the much more talked about, but later dated, Amesbury Archer, the Bowman was not an immigrant to Britain, nor were the vast majority of other known bell beaker burials. Isotope analysis shows that he, and most others, were born and lived their lives in Britain, though they traveled widely within Britain, possibly as part of pastoral seasonal migrations. Though the majority of his ancestry was of European steppe origin, it is estimated that he had about 41% admixture from the Neolithic British farmer population. This tells us with certainty that though he is carbon dated to have died sometime between 2580 and 2340, this doesn't reflect the date that his ancestors arrived in Britain. For him to carry this percentage of local DNA means that he had to have been, at the very least, the 3rd generation of his family in Britain, but perhaps more realistically 4 or even more generations. If we add that factor to his own carbon dating from the most recently calibrated dates from which we are also basing our dating of Stonehenge, assuming each generation to be about 20 years, we get a date of between 2660 and 2420 for when the Bowman's Beaker folk great-great-grandfather potentially wed a Neolithic British farmer. Even a conservative estimate puts that by or before the building of Stonehenge. The Bowman's descendants had various levels of British farmer admixture, showing that there was an ongoing process of mixing going on with people who already carried various levels of British farmer ancestry. The time that the Bell Beaker burials first appeared in Britain do not show new immigrants. They show a local population already established and already integrated with elements of the local population, almost exclusively through the taking of native wives. Over time, the overall percentage of the Neolithic farmer ancestry becomes very small in the overall population, less than 10% on average. But the reality of this earliest period is much more dynamic, and it has an effect on the cultural practices of the Bastion Bowman. The reason for the later low percentage of British farmer DNA must be the result of a dramatically lower population of the Neolithic farmers versus the number of immigrants with steppe ancestry. By the early Bronze Age, the number of incomers simply flood the genetic pool, drowning out much of the Neolithic genetic ancestry. In relation to Stonehenge, this analysis leaves us with only two real possibilities. One possibility is that the Saracens were erected just as the Beaker people were entering the region, and that the Bastion Bowman was the leader of the first Bell Beakers to gain control over the area in Stonehenge. Due to his mixed ancestry, he and his descendants decided to continue to build Stonehenge and to create other monuments in the area, also commonly attributed to Neolithic farmers. The other alternative is that the Saracens of Stonehenge were not raised by the Neolithic people specifically, but represent something created by an early fusion of peoples, perhaps the earliest generation of so-called Bell Beakers, a monument, one of many they constructed in the area, to solidify their claim to their newly acquired land, express their power, and give thanks to the gods and ancestors for their achievements. It was constructed atop a noted sacred site of the previous population, signifying a change of ownership of the land, but also the continuity which they had, having adopted a number of aspects from the heritage of many of the mothers of the early settlers. This model, or something like it, is referred to as the steppe drift hypothesis, put forward by Reich and Armit in a 2018 paper, which discussed the genetic findings. They describe it in the following way. Steppe ancestry was introduced to Britain as an extension of its general westward movement across Europe, through a gradual process beginning perhaps as early as 2700 BC, when it appears in Central Europe, and ending as late as 2000 BC. Parallel north and eastward movement of the Beaker complex from Iberia was an essentially cultural phenomenon with no intrinsic genetic component. Due to the intersection of these genetic and cultural phenomena, migrants into Britain from circa 2450 BC frequently arrived equipped with objects and ideas associated with the Beaker complex. This means that though these genetic findings on the surface seem to support the idea that pots did equal people in the case of the Bell Beakers, this is misleading. The people were actually arriving in Britain long before the existence of Bell Beakers, as in the pots, and were simply spreading later with the continued movement of people and spread among the population as a trendy style. Unfortunately, however, it is at the present very difficult to validate this with certainty, though the earliest testable samples do prove that the first arrivals do predate any Bell Beaker evidence. The reason is that before the arrival of the Beaker package, the local population was practicing cremation, destroying genetic samples, and there are no known genetic samples from between 3000 BC and 2450 BC. The earliest Bell Beaker style pottery appears in Iberia around 2700 BC and is thought to have spread west through cultural exchange and trade. Although Central European Bell Beaker examples show obvious corded ware influence, with many bell beakers using chord patterns. The pattern was developed and then spread through Western Europe and into Britain and Ireland. Recent DNA tests on the people of the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age Orkney reveal that despite a lack of obvious bell beaker artifacts or styles, a genetic shift had also taken place there, with the introduction of steppe ancestry in the earliest samples from the Bronze Age. The first waves of Indo-European migration into Britain and Ireland was not initially linked to a specifically formulated bell beaker package. The important thing to realize is that the overwhelming majority of so-called Beaker people were not buried at all. Burial practices that left any trace seem to be reserved for very particular individuals, most probably recognized hereditary elites. The rest of the population was disposed of in a way that leaves little archaeological traces. Excarnation, a practice which some archaeologists speculate continued well into the Iron Age. Proof for this can be found at Seahenge, dated to exactly 2049 BC. Despite the name, it was not actually a henge, however. A circle of all oak timbers, brought from many kilometers away, surrounded the upside-down roots of a very large oak tree. It's theorized, and I believe correctly, that upon the roots of this oak tree, bodies of the deceased were placed to decay under the rays of the sun and be devoured by carrion birds. When the bones were totally cleaned, they may have been laid out on the ground to disintegrate, and another body would be placed upon the roots. The traces of these structures have been encountered by archaeologists before, but this was the first time that a surviving example was found which could explain what exactly it was. This, or a very similar method, was how the vast majority of dead were dealt with by bell beakers and their descendants well into the Iron Age. It has parallels with beliefs in Zoroastrianism, which developed out of the local Proto-Indo-European traditions, and may well have been part of the original Proto-Indo-European practices. In Ireland, Beaker people are linked to the return of megalithic-style wedge tombs. The reason for this may be influence from the first farmers. They would also have been inspired by ancient sites, not unlike people today. Their styles were thus influenced by that which they saw around them, and those things which were already present. Unfortunately, between 3000 BC and about 2450 BC, we have no clear idea what was going on genetically between these times. Yet by 2450, all the testable results show steppe ancestry, often in large quantities. Even the few male individuals who retained a Y haplogroup from Neolithic populations had extensive steppe ancestry. One thing is certain, people of Indo-European ancestry were already in Britain and Ireland by 2500 BC. This date is very important in the prehistoric archaeological timeline of Britain, for it wasn't only Stonehenge that underwent construction at this time or later. In Orkney, even as Neolithic sites like Skara Brae were being abandoned, the Ring of Brodgar was being lifted, estimated to have been built between 2500 and 2000 BC. In Wiltshire, the same region as Stonehenge, is found the massive mound of Silbury Hill, constructed between 2400 and 2300. It's been calculated that the creation of the hill would have required 500 men working full-time for 15 years to build it. Henge, just beside it, is also dated to around 2400 BC or later. Of course, there is also Avebury. One of the only carbon dates puts the establishment of the inner stones not earlier than 2500 BC. Mount Pleasant-Henge in Dorset is dated to have begun construction sometime around 2400 BC, and the Thornborough Henges, a unique set of 3 henges in Yorkshire, are also thought to date to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. Right near Stonehenge is Woodhenge, carbon dated to about 2400 BC or later, located beside Durrington Walls, which was the site of a genuine Neolithic farmer village which had been abandoned hundreds of years earlier. In Ireland, a recent discovered Woodhenge, dated to approximately 2400 BC, is located at the Hill of Tara, which in Gaelic myth is the site of the High King, both of men and gods. All of these monuments, and many more besides, especially of the Henge style, date to within the period when Beaker people were spreading throughout Britain and Ireland. Perhaps it could be said that this is a coincidence. After all, there are no such henges in Europe where these Beaker people came from, except there are. In Pömmelte, Germany, are the archaeological remains of a sacred space that has been called the Woodhenge of Pömmelte. It has a similar layout as the Stonehenge site, or of the Woodhenge at Tara, and it was also made entirely of wood. The site was built by Beakers and dates to around 2300 BC, only recently rediscovered in 2016. It also has an important solar alignment, with 2 entrances to the site corresponding to festivals of later Irish, the cross-quarter days, Lunasa and Imbolc. This differs from Stonehenge in that the importance is placed there on the winter solstice, but while details differ, the overwhelming correspondence between this German Beaker site and the Henges of Britain cannot be denied. These structures may have been more numerous in the region, partly inspired perhaps by much more ancient Neolithic enclosures, which are similar but not identical, such as Gossex, but are now obscured by later land use. Neolithic and Bronze Age sites are more easily noticeable and better preserved in Britain and Ireland than almost anywhere else in Europe. Stonehenge's building techniques strongly suggest it was built based on wooden examples, and so far, several such Stonehenge-like wooden sites have been found. Further investigation may well uncover more such monuments linked to Beaker people in Central Europe. The British Woodhenge, just northeast of Stonehenge, is carbon dated to 2400 BC or later. At the construction level is a mixture of native grooveware and Beaker pottery. It was built of 168 wooden posts, and though now often argued to have been open to the sky, a type of forest of posts, it's also possible that the posts actually represent the supports for a massive roofed structure. We can compare its layout to that found at the Irish site of Ewenmacha, also called Navan Fort. In legend, it was the home of the King of Ulster, Conchobar mac Nessa, who is likened to a god in tales. Its creation is connected to the goddess Macha, sometimes called Grian, the Gaelic word for sun. Archaeological studies suggest that it was constructed around the 1st century BC, possibly as a massive temple, and after some time it was buried beneath a giant mound, entombing the sacred site. The house is described in early Gaelic texts. 365 persons in Conchobar's household, that is, the number of days in the year, is the number of men that were in Conchobar's household. In other words, it's described as a celestial palace, reflective of the totality of the sky and the movement of the sun throughout the year. The site was demarcated as sacred since at least the Bronze Age. As the layout of Woodhenge is quite similar, we may be looking at the remains of a palatial temple, possibly the seat of a great king who took up rule in the region of Wiltshire at the very time when many massive monuments were being built in the area. Large midden mounds of massive feasts were found at the site, so whether a house, a temple, or just a bunch of posts, this was a place where people gathered to eat and celebrate, much as they gathered for annual feasts at the house of Conchobar, or the High King in Tower. Tara, or Tower, looms large in Gaelic mythology as a seat of the sacred High King, first of the gods, then of men. On the hill of Tara was recently discovered a Neolithic Woodhenge structure compared to Stonehenge, but also comparable to the Beaker site in Germany. It's estimated to have been built around 2400 BC. Now the name Tower comes from the same root as the Greek word temenos. It refers to an area of land that's been demarcated out as sacred. As the High King in ancient times was largely a sacred role, he was located here where he was in connection with the gods. And it's hard to believe that this Chalcolithic wooden henge is located on the hill of Tara by complete coincidence. It's much more likely that we have a direct archaeological proof for thousands of years of cultural continuity. Now, some argue that these great monuments were created by the Neolithic people as a type of last gasp of a dying society. Almost never has a group at the point of destruction accomplished so many massive works of labor and technological achievement. The ability to mobilize labor and resources on a scale to create not one, but many massive works shows immense power, not a population in its death throes. All male bands were likely the basis of all steppe migration. Migrant warrior bands would enter into a region, establish the basis of a community, raid the locals, take local women for wives, and begin to establish themselves. The process would then replicate every generation or two. However, once they secured a region, they would reconnect with their families, in the same way that the ancient Greeks did, who settled the Black Sea coast or Italy. It may be that at this later point, that entire families began migrating into Britain, into areas already under control of their kin. Supportive evidence for this process may be found in the divergent genetic results in Orkney. Recent genetic studies in Bronze Age Orkney revealed that despite very few examples of Beaker artifacts, steppe ancestry had been brought in during the Chalcolithic along with the R1b haplogroup. However, in Orkney, unlike in most other places in Britain, the male lineage of the Neolithic population was not largely replaced. A large part of the genetic shift in Orkney was not due to male Beakers, of which initially only a small number settled in Orkney, but of Beaker women. It seems that initial settlements of the Beaker men on the island saw them being interjected into an existing Neolithic population, perhaps as its rulers. Orkney was one of the few places where the Neolithic population did not seem to have collapsed, and so still had a significant community. Later, as Beaker folk expanded, the people of Orkney increasingly married Beaker women, and the Orcadian women would have been sent as wives of British Beaker kings and warriors, and through this process, by the Bronze Age, Orkney had significant steppe ancestry, yet relatively few R1b male steppe ancestors. This process likely also explains how steppe ancestry spread to people in other areas of Europe as well, such as the I1a of Scandinavia. Alliances were formed through the exchange of women and local Neolithic elites in Orkney, perhaps originally conquered by a small group of Beakers in the initial settlement phase, then formed alliances with them, taking Beaker wives and integrating themselves into the new political reality. They may also have adopted their language. In the first period of the spread was when the most mixing with the local population would have taken place. Certain cultural and religious traditions from the existing population were transmitted, mostly through women. Our earliest genetic results of Beaker people in Britain show that this process had already taken place, and was to some extent still ongoing. During that early period, the descendants of those warrior bands would initially be half Neolithic farmer. Though they would be raised to follow their father's line, culturally, they would have been influenced by their mother's side as well, creating what many archaeologists see as the basic continuity between Neolithic and Bronze Age, which is why some were surprised by the genetic results and find them hard to accept. Later Beaker settlers would have integrated themselves into an already established community, which already developed these local traditions and passed them on generation to generation. The Bell Beakers were also closely linked to the earliest uses of copper in Britain and Ireland. The earliest known copper mining from the islands took place in Ross, County Kerry, and artifacts found at the site date its beginning around 2400 BC. And a chemical isotope analysis shows that almost 2/3 of the copper in Copper Age Britain came from this site, and as much as 12% in the Netherlands, showing local trade connections linking back to the Lower Rhine and with the Indo-European community there. Locating this copper meant having a knowledge of the area, physical control of the site, and a community to maintain the industry and the ability to trade it over long distances. If the mine began operating sometime around 2400 BC, the presence of the Beaker communities in that area had to have preceded the mine, perhaps by several generations. And this again points to a very early date for Indo-European activity in Britain and Ireland. So by 2400, archaeological evidence shows clearly that these Indo-European people, with metal technology and advanced shipbuilding techniques, had spread throughout Britain and Ireland. Their burials throughout Wiltshire show that they had gained supremacy in the region of Stonehenge by at least the period of the Bastion Bowman. By 2400, they were deep within Ireland, undertaking copper mining operations, and were present throughout Scotland and Wales. These so-called Beaker people were in great ascendancy, and it was they who would have had the organizational ability, power, and wealth to be able to organize massive projects throughout Britain during this time. The only realistic way that the Neolithic people were responsible for all of these late Neolithic structures is if they had a large, healthy population and well-organized communities. But this flies in the face of the general view that the incoming Beaker people gained such quick dominance because the British farmers were very small in number and unorganized. Precisely where the most monuments show up is where the highest density of Beaker graves are. If these structures were built by the Neolithic population, we would expect that the strongest Neolithic farmer communities would be located near here. And this should be the last place that we would find the intrusion of the Beaker people. As the reverse is true, we have to call into question previous assumptions. It's not true that these steppe-derived people and the first farmers of Britain were not mixing. They were. But the overall outcome was a small percentage because the overall population disparity. This is expressed through the strong continuity from the Neolithic all the way into the Iron Age, which so many archaeologists recognize. Though this Neolithic farmer segment becomes only a small portion of the genetic makeup of the Bronze Age and later people of Britain and Ireland, they nevertheless had a large impact on these British Beaker people, who carried on visible cultural continuity with a continued creation of stone circles and bank and ditch enclosures. Though hopefully more genetic evidence will shed further light on this situation, either proving or disproving this genetic drift theory, it's possible that those who set the sarsen stones of Stonehenge were an early fusion between Indo-European settlers and Neolithic farmers, and this set the cultural tone which their sons and grandsons carried on for thousands of years, the direct ancestors of the British and Irish people today. I hope you like this video. This of course is only one theory, but feel free to make up your own mind, and make your own views known in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. Thank you all for listening, and as always, stand tall.